Formula One races in the modern era can be likened to well-oiled machines. Pre-race and post-race events are organised down to the minute, and race organisers control thousands upon thousands of people in the most seamless fashion. 50 years earlier, and the story was far from the same. There was little standardisation from Grand Prix to Grand Prix in terms of what happened prior to a race, and whilst crowd control wasn't poor across the board, there were a few occasions where it wasn't managed well. This is one of those events. Welcome to episode 5 of 70s Tales, Beyond Control. Hello everyone, and welcome to the penultimate episode in this season of 70s Tales. My name is Ben Hocking, and today my focus goes to the 1970 Mexican Grand Prix. The last Grand Prix in the country for 15 years. We'll be looking at why this was the case. I hope you enjoy. The Mexican Grand Prix of 1970 acted as the final race in the season. The championship was settled, albeit in tragic circumstances. Jochen Rindt, who had passed away at the Italian Grand Prix, had secured enough points for no one else to catch him. F1 was preparing to crown their first posthumous world champion, and the drivers were prepared for a dead rubber battle in Mexico City. Bar the dominance of Rindt in the middle of the season, 1970 was fairly open, and predicting winners was far from an easy task. The Ferrari duo of Ickx and Regazzoni could be confident heading into the race, sitting P2 and P3 in the championship, but there were plenty of others looking to finish the season in style. Emerson Fittipaldi was fresh off of his first victory at Watkins Glen. Home favourite Pedro Rodriguez had won a race earlier in the season, as had Jack Brabham, and he had extra cause to do well, as the 1970 Mexican Grand Prix would be his 128th and last. Brabham calling time on his career after it became clear in Friday practice that the entire field would be playing the game Catch the Ferraris, for they proved to be very quick. Ickx and Regazzoni topped the timing sheet and did so on basically full tanks of fuel. Based on Friday's times, it was just the Tyrrell of Stewart that would give them any problems in the pursuit of pole position. Saturday practice confirmed that it would be a 3-horse race for pole, Stewart versus the Scuderia. Ickx's engine blowing up early in the session put a dent in Ferrari's side. Ickx's best time was comfortably good enough for P3 on the grid, but it was left up to Regazzoni to tame Jackie Stewart. Stewart put together an impressive lap that seemed destined for pole position, but Regazzoni responded late in the day, demoting Stewart to P2 by just 0.02 of a second. To emphasise the difference between the top 3 and everyone else, Jack Brabham lined up P4 on the grid, but he was a whopping 1.71 seconds off the pace set by Regazzoni. The Mexican Grand Prix had proven popular with the locals since it had first appeared on the calendar in 1962 as a non-championship Grand Prix. As a result, the organisers had become used to seeing a strong crowd, but in 1970 the number surpassed even their wildest estimations, 200,000. It's tough to say why the crowd increased so much for this year's race. Perhaps it had something to do with home favourite Pedro Rodriguez winning a race earlier in the year and finishing P2 behind Fittipaldi at the previous race. Having said this, Rodriguez was starting the race from just P7 on the grid, and his likelihood of victory was slim. The likelihood of anyone winning the race seemed slim not long before the start. Talks of cancellation were ramping up as a lot of the crowd ignored the restrictions on spectator areas and took up spots on the safety banks. Some even decided to sit on the Armco barrier. Naturally, there were now massive safety concerns. Minds were cast back to the Spanish Grand Prix earlier in the season, where Jackie Oliver and Jackie Ickx had been involved in a fiery crash. Unbelievably, they both came out with very minor injuries, but if a similar incident were to occur here, the result could be catastrophic. Attempts were made to push the crowd back, Pedro Rodriguez appealing to his home crowd to see sense, and Jackie Stewart as well making an impassioned plea to the crowd to allow the drivers to get on with their job in as safe a manner as possible. The pleas to the crowd were partially successful. The crowd did move back somewhat, although a very long way from ideal. The result of the chaos was a lengthy delay to the start of the race. Almost an hour and a half had surpassed before the drivers could set off on a cycle lap. This was not helped by the fact that many of the restless and agitated crowd members had started throwing bottles onto the circuit, meaning they had to be cleared away. The paddock was stuck between a rock and a hard place. Realistically, this race should have been cancelled. The crowd was still way too close, and the smallest misstep by any of the 19 drivers could have spelled disaster. But at that point in time, the drivers and teams were surrounded by 200,000 impatient fans who wanted to get the race underway. I sure wouldn't have wanted to be the person to tell them that the race wouldn't be going ahead, and a full-scale riot as a result of the decision was not out of the question. The drivers decided that the possibility of a devastating crash was preferable to the inevitability of a massive crowd unrest, so the race got underway, fortunately without incident. Regazzoni leading Stewart and then Ickx. Despite his good start and looking for his second race victory, Regazzoni would soon fall behind Ickx and Stewart. Ickx using the slipstream to get ahead of both cars from P3, and Stewart returning to P2 with an overtake on Regazzoni. The Tyrrell of Jackie Stewart had proven to be fast during 1970, but highly unreliable, and this continued here. On lap 14 of 65, the lead of the race became a Ferrari 1-2, with Jackie Stewart forced to dive into the pits, rejoining out of the points and a lap down to the leaders. This therefore left Brabham third, with a chance of a career-closing podium. Out front, Ickx was extending his gap over Regazzoni and was able to manage his race much more comfortably following Stewart's problems. If Jackie Stewart was hoping that he had his daily issue and the rest of the afternoon would be stress-free, he was proven very, very wrong. On lap 33, Stewart came into the pits to retire due to a broken suspension, bent wheel and a damaged monocoque, amongst other things. Nothing overly unusual about that, until you learn what caused the damage. A stray dog had found its way onto the circuit. Stewart was sadly unable to avoid it. The incident could easily have been even worse. The damage to the car caused the Tyrrell to weave violently to the left towards an area where spectators were situated just off the track. Fortunately, Stewart was able to regain control in time and directed the car away from the people, but Jackie himself knew how close those spectators were to serious injury or death. Out front, Ickx remained untroubled, as was Regazzoni in second, but Brabham's career was not to end in the way that he would have liked. Just 12 laps from the end, the 44-year-old's engine gave up on him, drawing the curtain on his long and mightily successful career. As the race entered its final stages, the fear of an incident with the crowd only increased. Spectators became more and more confident, getting closer and closer to the track as the laps went on. The number of near misses increased, and the track was becoming narrower with every lap that passed. Jackie Ickx took a commanding victory that solidified his second place in the championship standings, but as soon as he crossed the line, the crowd dangerously spilled onto the circuit, everyone else forced to stop their cars quickly as they crossed the line. Regazzoni came home second, and Denny Hulme was the beneficiary of Brabham's retirement in third. The 1970 Mexican Grand Prix had been an unmitigated disaster that had somehow managed to avoid a disastrous event. Despite there being no injuries or casualties, save for the stray dog, it was clear that this had only been achieved through sheer luck rather than anything else. The FIA cancelled the 1971 Mexican Grand Prix, and the Formula One circus would not return to the city until 1986. Thank you for joining me today. As ever, please do let me know what you thought about the episode in the comments, and consider subscribing for more Formula One content. There's one more episode in this season. I'll see you there, and until next time, keep braking late.